Simon and Jackie had a love story that many envied and admired. They were inseparable, bound not just by affection, but by a deep understanding and mutual respect. Jackie was a radiant woman with a kind heart, while Simon was a thoughtful, loving husband who would do anything to see his wife smile. Their laughter often filled their modest apartment, making it feel warm and full of life. The only shadow that loomed over their otherwise perfect marriage was their struggle to have children. Year after year, they tried without success. Each negative pregnancy test chipped away at their spirits. Still, their love never wavered. Simon, Jackie would often say, holding his hand, "I know it's hard, but we have each other. That's enough for me." Simon would kiss her forehead and reply, "And I'll always believe our miracle is coming." Always. Their faith and perseverance led them to countless doctors, specialists, and even spiritual retreats. They prayed together, fasted, and tried every medical treatment recommended. Then, one sunny afternoon, Jackie surprised Simon with the news that changed their lives forever. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, holding out the positive test with trembling hands. Simon's eyes widened. "What? Jackie, are you serious?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "We're having twins, Simon." Overwhelmed with emotion, Simon lifted her off the ground, spinning her around the living room as they laughed and cried together. "God, thank you," Simon exclaimed. "Our miracle is finally here." The months that followed were filled with joy and preparation. They painted the nursery a soft yellow and filled it with tiny clothes, toys, and cribs. Jackie blossomed with her pregnancy, her smile even more radiant as she felt their babies kick and grow inside her. One evening, when Jackie was 8 months pregnant, they decided to have a quiet night at home. The aroma of freshly made popcorn lingered in the air as they snuggled on the couch, watching an old romantic movie. "Can you believe this is going to be us soon?" Jackie said, her voice dreamy. "Watching movies with 2 little ones asleep in our arms." Simon chuckled. "I'm ready for the chaos. Bring it on." They shared a tender kiss, savoring the peace and love that enveloped them. But that peace was brutally shattered. A sudden, violent crash came from the front door. Simon sprang to his feet, heart racing. "Stay here," he whispered to Jackie, who clutched her swollen belly in fear. Before he could take a step, 3 masked men burst into the living room, armed and menacing. "Don't move," one of them barked, pointing a gun at Simon. "What do you want?" Simon demanded, his voice shaking. "Take whatever you want, just don't hurt us." The leader sneered. "We'll take what we came for." Without warning, one of the men struck Simon across the face with the butt of his gun. He fell to the floor, dazed and bleeding. Jackie screamed, but the men silenced her with brutal force. Simon struggled to stay conscious, his vision blurring as he saw them drag Jackie away. "No, Jackie," he slurred, but darkness claimed him. When Simon woke up, the living room was eerily silent. His head throbbed and blood crusted his face. Panic gripped him as he struggled to his feet. "Jackie," he shouted, stumbling through the house. His heart stopped when he found her in the bedroom. Jackie lay motionless on the blood-soaked floor, her once glowing face pale and lifeless. Her dress was torn, and the evidence of the unspeakable violence she had endured was clear. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of blood. "No, no, no, no." Simon collapsed beside her, cradling her in his arms. "Jackie, please, wake up. Please, God, don't take her from me." Trembling, he fumbled for his phone and dialed the emergency number. His voice was hoarse as he pleaded, "I need an ambulance. My wife, she's hurt. She's not breathing. Please hurry." The operator's voice was calm but urgent. "Stay on the line, sir. Help is on the way." Simon clung to Jackie, rocking back and forth as he whispered desperate prayers. "I promised I'd protect you," he choked out. "I failed you, Jackie. I failed our babies." The ambulance arrived minutes later, but time had already sealed its verdict. The paramedics worked frantically, but Simon knew. The hollow expression on their faces confirmed his worst nightmare. "I'm sorry," one of them said gently. "She's gone. The babies too." Simon's world shattered. The weight of the loss crushed him, leaving a void that no words could fill. "I should have died with them," he whispered, his voice broken. The paramedic placed a hand on his shoulder. "You survived for a reason. Don't lose hope." But hope felt like a foreign concept to Simon as he watched the love of his life and their unborn children carried away. He stood there, numb as the world around him moved on, oblivious to the devastation in his heart. Life had dealt him a blow that seemed impossible to recover from. Simon's heart ached with every step as he made the painful preparations to bury Jackie. The day of the funeral arrived, and the weight of it pressed down on him like an unbearable burden. Surrounded by mourners, Simon's mind was elsewhere. He had no tears left. His grief had transformed into something darker. The thought of the brutal attack on his beloved Jackie and their unborn children consumed him, seething with an unrelenting rage. As they lowered her casket into the ground, Simon stood there, trembling with fury and sorrow. He whispered a vow, one that would fuel every moment of his existence from that day on. "I will find you," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Whoever did this to you, whoever took you from me, I swear I will make them pay." The burial ceremony ended and the mourners dispersed, but Simon's resolve remained unshaken. He stayed at the cemetery long after the others left, staring at the fresh grave that marked the end of his once perfect world. Days passed, but Simon couldn't rest. He became consumed by one thing: finding his wife's killers. Every waking moment was spent obsessing over the attack. He couldn't shake the image of Jackie's lifeless body and the faces of the men who had taken everything from him. He needed justice, no matter the cost. Simon began poring over every detail of the night. He revisited the CCTV footage from their apartment, desperate to find any clue, anything that might lead him to the perpetrators. The footage was difficult to watch, but he forced himself to relive the horrific scene. His mind screamed in fury as he saw the armed men beat him unconscious and violate his pregnant wife. But then, a flicker of hope. In the midst of Jackie's screams, she managed to rip the mask from one of the attackers. His heart raced as he watched the face of the man exposed in the footage. Simon zoomed in on the image, his breath hitching in his chest. There was no mistaking it. He recognized the face. It was a man he had seen before, though he couldn't quite place where. The realization hit him like a freight train. It was the son of the Inspector General of Police. Simon had seen him at social events, in the presence of his father, always carrying himself like someone above the law. With this crucial evidence in hand, Simon immediately took the case to the police, desperate for justice. But what he didn't expect was the cold, calculating response from the authorities. When Simon presented the footage to the officers, their reaction was not one of concern or determination. Instead, they seemed uncomfortable. The room became tense as they exchanged knowing glances. The officer in charge cleared his throat. "Mr. Simon, we understand your anger, but you've made a very serious accusation," he said, his voice calm but lacking sincerity. Simon's heart raced. "You see the man's face. He's the one who did this to my wife. He's the one who took everything from me. You have to arrest him." The officer's gaze dropped to the floor. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Simon. The man in that video is indeed the son of the Inspector General of Police. His name is Kelvin, but..." Simon's blood ran cold as he realized where this conversation was headed. "But what?" he demanded. The officer hesitated, clearly trying to choose his words carefully. "You see, Mr. Simon, Kelvin is untouchable. His father is the most powerful man in the force. If you press this issue, if you pursue this any further, we cannot guarantee your safety. We cannot guarantee that you'll ever see justice." Simon's hands clenched into fists. "So you're telling me to just forget about what happened to my wife and children? To let them get away with murder?" The officer's voice dropped, now laced with a threatening undertone. "I'm not telling you anything, Mr. Simon. I'm advising you. Leave this alone, or there will be consequences." Simon's mind raced. His anger swelled within him, but he forced himself to stay calm, to think. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I will not be intimidated. I will not stop until they pay for what they've done." But deep down, Simon knew the police were not on his side. His heart sank as he realized that his pursuit of justice had placed him in direct opposition to one of the most powerful families in the country. That night, Simon was unable to sleep. He felt like a cornered animal, desperate and exposed. Hours later, he received a chilling phone call. "Mr. Simon, this is your final warning. If you don't drop this case, we'll make sure you regret it," the voice on the other end of the line said, cold and devoid of any empathy. "You won't be able to hide anywhere. You will be silenced." Fear gripped Simon, but so did something else, a fierce determination. He knew he could no longer trust the system he had once believed in. The authorities, the very people who were supposed to protect him, had become his enemies. He had no choice but to take matters into his own hands. He packed a bag in the dead of night, knowing that staying in the country would only bring more danger to his life. He left a letter behind for his family, explaining why he had to disappear, why he could no longer fight within the confines of a corrupted system. Simon crossed the border into Ghana, determined to escape the clutches of the police and the deadly reach of the Inspector General's son. But even in a foreign land, the weight of his vow remained heavy on his chest. "I will find you," Simon swore under his breath as he boarded a flight to Accra. "You can run, but I'll never stop hunting you down. No matter how far you go, I'll make you pay for what you did to Jackie and my babies." Simon had spent weeks in Ghana keeping a low profile. He rented a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood and tried to maintain a routine that wouldn't draw attention. Every day was a battle between grief and rage. His nights were haunted by the memory of Jackie and their unborn twins, while his days were filled with plotting how he would bring Kelvin to justice. But Simon knew he needed a strategy. Ghana was foreign territory, and his resources were limited. He couldn't afford any mistakes. Patience, he reminded himself. Revenge is best served cold. One afternoon, Simon decided to step out for groceries. The sun was high, and the streets buzzed with life. He walked through the aisles of the mall, placing essentials into his basket. The mundane act momentarily dulled the sharp edges of his pain. As he moved toward the checkout counter, he saw a man approaching from the opposite direction. Time seemed to slow as Simon's eyes locked onto the familiar face. His heart skipped a beat, and then fury surged through his veins. It was Kelvin. The man walked confidently, dressed in casual but expensive clothes. His arm was around a beautiful woman who carried herself with grace. A little boy, no older than 5, clung to Kelvin's other hand, laughing as they moved together like a picture-perfect family. Simon's vision blurred with rage. The man who had destroyed his life was here, in the same mall, living a carefree and happy existence. Kelvin's laughter echoed in Simon's ears, a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. Simon gripped the handle of his basket so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded, and his breath became shallow. The desire to act on impulse consumed him. "Find a weapon," a dark voice whispered in his mind. "End him right here, right now." Simon's eyes darted around the mall. There were sharp objects on the shelves, heavy items that could do the job. His muscles tensed as he calculated the fastest way to strike. But then another thought pierced through his rage. Death? That would be too easy, too merciful. Kelvin wouldn't suffer if he died quickly. Simon wanted him to feel the pain, the helplessness, and the torment that Jackie had felt. He wanted Kelvin to lose everything, his comfort, his reputation, his family. And only then would Simon consider ending him. Simon took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. He couldn't afford to act impulsively. Not here, not now. He needed a plan, one that would ensure Kelvin paid in the most excruciating way possible. Kelvin and his family passed by without noticing Simon. The rage simmered beneath Simon's skin, but he kept his expression neutral. His mind raced as he silently followed them at a safe distance, observing every detail: the car they got into, the license plate number, and the direction they drove off. Simon's heart was pounding in his chest as he followed Kelvin's car from a distance, his hands gripped tightly on the wheel. The wheels of his mind turned faster than the car itself, his thoughts spinning with dark possibilities. He had almost considered ramming the car from behind, sending it spiraling into an accident. It would be quick, no more pain, no more suffering. But then the thought of innocent lives being lost, of a woman and child, stopped him cold. He wasn't a monster. No matter how much rage burned inside him, he couldn't imagine hurting an innocent family. The images of Jackie and their unborn children torn away from him were still too fresh. But Simon knew he had to take control of his emotions. He couldn't make a rash decision. Not yet. He needed answers. So he followed. The car wound through the city streets, eventually driving into an upscale neighborhood. Simon's eyes narrowed as he watched them turn into a large, beautifully manicured estate. The mansion loomed behind a wrought iron gate, its towering structure more like a fortress than a home. Simon parked at a distance, out of sight, but close enough to see the house clearly. He took a deep breath and checked the time. He had been following them for hours, but his mind wouldn't allow him to rest. There was no way Kelvin, who was supposedly involved in an attack on him and his family, would live in a place like this. Why would someone who had destroyed Simon's life live so comfortably in a place so untouched by the consequences of his actions? He stayed in his car, eyes glued to the mansion as the night stretched on. His thoughts were a whirlwind. But one thing remained certain. He needed answers. He couldn't let this go. The questions kept piling up. Why did Kelvin come after him specifically? Was there more to the attack than just a robbery gone wrong? Why would someone so seemingly rich and powerful feel the need to hurt someone like Simon, a man who had no wealth, no power? Simon was still processing these thoughts when the early morning hours arrived. The stillness of the night was shattered by the sound of the gate opening. His eyes snapped to attention as Kelvin's car slowly began to pull out of the driveway, this time without his wife and child. Simon's heart skipped a beat. This was the opening he had been waiting for. Alone with no one to shield him, Kelvin was vulnerable. This was it. This was the moment. Simon's hands clenched around the steering wheel, his mind fully consumed by the singular focus of his mission. The anger that had built up for months was boiling over, but Simon had a clearer sense of purpose now. He wasn't just acting on rage, he was in control. He waited for the perfect moment, the right stretch of road where the darkness would hide his actions. And then, with one swift motion, Simon slammed his car into Kelvin's. The impact was brutal. Kelvin's car spun off the road, tires screeching as it veered off course and slammed into a tree with a sickening crunch. Simon's pulse thundered in his ears as he slammed the brakes and jumped out of his car. His gaze immediately went to the wreckage of Kelvin's vehicle. The front end was crumpled, smoke rising from the engine. Inside, Kelvin was motionless, his head having hit the steering wheel with force. The air was thick with the scent of burning rubber and the sharp tang of metal. Simon approached the car cautiously, keeping his mind focused. He was no longer a man bent on blind vengeance. He was methodical, calculated. He opened the passenger side door and dragged Kelvin out with a surprising amount of strength. Kelvin's body hung limp as Simon hoisted him over his shoulder, ignoring the pain that shot through his muscles. The man who had caused Simon's entire world to shatter, the one who had taken everything from him, was now at his mercy. Simon tossed Kelvin's unconscious body into the back seat of his own car and sped off, taking the back streets to avoid being seen. His thoughts were a whirlwind, but his resolve remained firm. He was bringing Kelvin to a place where he could finally get the answers he had been seeking. Once they reached Simon's house, a small, quiet place tucked away from prying eyes, he hauled Kelvin inside and dragged him to the basement. Simon had prepared for this moment, making sure no one would be around to stop him. He tied Kelvin up with rope, securing him tightly to a metal chair in the dimly lit basement. Simon stepped back, admiring his work. Kelvin was still unconscious, his head resting against the chair, his breath shallow but steady. Simon splashed a bucket of cold water across Kelvin's face, instantly jolting him awake. His eyes shot open in panic, and he gasped for air, his body writhing as he tried to process the shock of the cold liquid. He shook his head, still disoriented, and tried to push himself up, but the ropes that bound him to the chair held him firm. His eyes met Simon's, and that's when he saw it. The rage that simmered beneath Simon's calm exterior. The man wasn't just angry, he was seething with a deep, unrelenting fury. Simon stepped forward, his hand shaking slightly as he held up his phone, showing the footage that had been burned into his mind for the past several days. The grainy video displayed the brutal scene. His wife, Jackie, helpless, her face terror-stricken as she clawed at her attackers. And then, there it was, the moment she managed to pull off the mask of one of her assailants. Kelvin's face. The truth in all its horrifying clarity was now inescapable. Kelvin's face drained of all color as he realized the game was over. Simon didn't need to say a word. The evidence was undeniable. He was caught. Simon's eyes darkened with a cold fury that made Kelvin's breath catch in his throat. He felt trapped, like a cornered animal with no way out. Simon's voice was a low growl. "Do you know who I am? The man whose life you ruined? The man who has nothing left but revenge for the woman and children you killed?" Kelvin, his mind racing, suddenly sought to regain some semblance of control. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. He tried to shift in the chair, but the ropes dug into his skin. Simon didn't respond immediately. His anger was palpable, and the air around them seemed to thicken. He didn't need Kelvin's words. He knew who he was dealing with. But what Simon did next took Kelvin by surprise. Without warning, Simon grabbed a knife from a table nearby and drove it into Kelvin's palm. The sharp steel pierced his skin with ease, and Kelvin screamed in pain and gritted his teeth as blood oozed from the wound. "You're the son of a police officer who has no clue where his son is right now," Simon said, his voice trembling with fury. "And if you don't answer my questions, you will beg for death. But I won't give you the mercy of a quick end." Kelvin's eyes widened in horror as he saw his blood drip steadily to the floor. The pain was excruciating, and Simon's eyes remained locked on Kelvin, filled with a chilling resolve. "Please, please," Kelvin whimpered, his voice barely audible as he looked at Simon, now trembling in fear. Simon leaned in closer, his voice now a deadly whisper. "Tell me why. Why did you do this? Why my wife? Why my children? What made you think you had the right to destroy everything I ever loved?" Kelvin, now visibly shaking, stared at Simon with a mixture of fear and regret. He knew that there was no escape now, no more lies to cover up his actions. I knew her before you did," Kelvin began, his voice weak. "Jackie, we were together once, before you came into the picture." He paused as if trying to gather his thoughts, but his fear of Simon's wrath kept him from taking his time. "We broke up, but I never got over her. And when I heard that she was married, I wanted her back. I couldn't let go. You were just an obstacle, a man who stood in the way of what I thought was mine. But she didn't want me anymore, Simon. She chose you, and I couldn't stand it." Simon's hands trembled with fury as he absorbed Kelvin's words. "So you killed her because she chose me and not you?" Simon asked in fury. Simon clenched his fists, the rage inside him threatening to consume him. He was barely able to contain the tremor of fury in his voice. "You thought you could just take her. That's what this was all about. You're a monster. You ruined her. You killed my babies. And for what? Because you couldn't let go." Kelvin's eyes filled with tears, but his fear of Simon far outweighed any remorse he might have felt. I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to go that far. Please, Simon, I'm sorry. I never wanted this to happen. It wasn't supposed to be like this." Simon's lips curled into a sneer. "Sorry doesn't bring her back. Sorry doesn't give me back what you took from me. You'll never know what it's like to lose everything. And you'll never know peace again, Kelvin." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension, and Simon's hands shook as he prepared for what would come next. He wasn't done yet.